secret that India imports more than 70 and nearly 80% of its crude requirements and is heavily dependent on global markets to fuel its industries and of course all of the petroleum products, which is why the long-standing plan to blend ethanol with gasoline becomes so important. Now, it's an ambitious plan which has been around for ages, really. And currently, we have gone up to 8% of ethanol blended. The plan is now and the goal is to go up to 20% of ethanol blended with gasoline, and that deadline has been advanced by 2 years to 2023. It's a story my colleague Karishma first broke on ET Now. Let's listen in first to what the latest is.
This definitely comes at a time where it's going to soften the blow to consumers because the rising fuel prices in the country, government's decision of further advancing ethanol blending target to 2023 is going to be beneficial in a two-dimensional way. Primarily, of course, because it cuts down India's major expensive oil imports. We know that India is almost 80% dependent on other countries for oil. And secondly, it is going to be a very big move domestically for sugar companies and India's plan on ethanol procurement. In fact, India currently almost produces about 2 billion liters of ethanol. It's aiming to produce about 10% of ethanol blending target, which is going to be around 4 billion liters next year. And by 2023, we are targeting a whopping 10 billion liters of ethanol production in order to, of course, blend it with 20% program with petrol in order to use as an alternative fuel. Government recently also announced use of E100 in vehicles as a ethanol blended fuel, which has about almost 90% ethanol. This was after government decided that because of increased petrol prices, it's important that government takes an alternative fuel. Ethanol. This was after government decided that because of increased petrol prices, it's important that government takes an alternative fuel method.
All right, so what is this ethanol plan all about? It's first important to understand that where has it come from? It's also come, from the need to reduce India's dependence on import of crude. It's also come from a need to have something to do with all of our excess sugar stock. There is an issue there with an overproduction of sugar. You can't reduce the rate that you give farmers of sugarcane for various reasons. It would be unfair to them, and it's a politically poor decision. And then you have this ballooning arrears that sugar processing companies owe the farmers. Adding more ethanol and producing ethanol instead with that excess stock and adding it to petrol seems like a win-win situation. But is it truly win-win? How can it work out? And will this policy work for India? Will the auto sector be ready? We're trying to get you every angle of this story this evening. Praful Vithalani is with us. He's the chairman of All India Sugar Trade Association. Nikunj Sanghi, chairman of ASDC and director at FADA, is with us. Sabyasachi Majumdar, group head and senior VP at ICRA, on the show as well. Gentlemen, thank you for speaking with us. Mr. Praful, let me begin by just getting your take. Why is the ethanol plan important? And how do you feel about the goal and the deadline for increasing it to 20% blended ethanol being advanced to 2023?
Yeah, this is required by this way. Actually, sugar was having a cyclical commodity production with 4 years with bumper production and 2 years of lower production. And then we don't have the inventory. But after having some policies like, MSP to sell the finished product of sugar, not to sell below 3,100, previously it was 2,900 per quintal, and release mechanism monthly. So, supply doesn't get flooded in the market, and at least price linked with the FRP of sugarcane, that sugar mills will get started. The journey of ethanol started on 25th of August 2017. When ICRA, myself and with my colleague we went to Prime Minister's office and met Mr. Anurag Jain, Joint Secretary to the Prime Minister office, where the discussion was taken. He has sugar every time, and what to do with this. So that day, that Anurag Jain, previously before that 17-18, we were hardly blending 1%, but he was a dynamic officer who take this issue very fast way. Then even our Nitin Gadkari was also on the same platform. So he also helped to how to go ahead. See, we are losing our currency while importing the crude. So this is like win-win situation because we use ethanol blending into the petrol and diesel. So that is the saving of currency as well as what to do with the excess. You said no arrears. So nowadays arrears are becoming less. Previously it was very huge. And the government immediately one by one taken a very good steps like GST was reduced from 18% to just 5%. Allotted free movement within the states all over India allowed for ethanol. Then interest subvention to make capacity availability was just 6% per annum to whoever sugar factories comes up for the expansion. And if the cost of interest, whichever is lesser, but 6% is always a lesser. So that subvention has given a very boost to sugar mills to invest and get the funds and do expansion. Products, it was just, by using sugarcane juice, molasses, and afterwards they allowed rice to be procured from FCI at 2,000 rupees. Then they allowed maize and the food which is not the grains, which is not fit for human consumption to be used for the ethanol. So all factors which government of India had taken, that has given a very good push. How it given, push that in 17-18 only the first year we went to 150 crore liters, 4% blending. Then the building of, it takes time 1 to 2 years of another capacity. So capacities we got in 1920, but the fruits are coming in 2021 with 325 crore liters we are expecting to be supplied to the OMC, and that will be 8.5% blending we are getting in this season. But at the same time, this 2023 is very surprise to overall industries and trade and everybody. But it is achievable. I will say it is achievable because our need of crude is getting.
So it's going to be tough but achievable. Yeah, so you're saying it's tough, but it's achievable. I get your point, Mr. Praful. Yeah, let me go across to Mr. Majumdar. Mr. Majumdar, can you break down for us why this move is crucial and what the pros and cons are? Is it truly achievable? Can we, ensure that level of supply continues? Because sugar also goes through its own cycle. Sugarcane goes through its own cycle.
So to answer that question, let's look at what has been happening over the past few years. Because of the introduction of new varieties of sugarcane which have substantially boosted the cane production as well as the recovery rate in the north, and because of relatively stable monsoons in several key growing areas, India has been every year producing a surplus of almost 5 to 6 million tons of sugar. Now, the government has, addressed that position by allowing substantial amount of exports to go out of the system through a support mechanism which basically gives you certain financial incentives provided you export a certain amount of, certain percentage of your sugar production in the international market. Now, there's a problem with this. First of all, your ability to export would really depend upon the international supply-demand scenario. In the case of an international surplus scenario, continued Indian exports would not be viable. More importantly, there are also, rulings against subsidies given to exports. So it's very clear that, exports are not a viable solution in the long run. In fact, I believe those, will have to be restricted by 2023. So the only way we can address this situation, in fact, the government is trying to address the situation by basically diverting the sucrose which would otherwise be used for producing sugar as a raw material for generation of ethanol by processing it in the distillery. So that is the main, motivation behind this. Now, we must remember one thing that while of course having more ethanol does help us with the forex position, as Mr. Vittalani mentioned, we must remember that petrol is only about 10% of the total petroleum consumption in the country, 10% or maybe even less. So even if we increase it by, let's suppose from 10%, although we are right now at only about 8%, so we are really reducing the total, petroleum imports by only about 1%. Of course, every penny saved, every dollar saved in foreign exchange is very important for us. But it's not really a game changer as well as the forex is concerned. Where it's really a game changer is providing stability and sustainability to the sugar industry, which is a very large employer, both, providing, a lot of quality income to the farmers, as well as a lot of, employment in the, factories, in the supply chain. So I see it as a very important, more from the, sugar industry perspective than from the energy security or forex perspective.
Mr. Sanghi, the question is, what about the auto sector? Will they be ready by 2023? Because part of this push is also for cleaner fuel. Do you think that the auto industry will be ready?
Well, as far as technology is concerned, I don't think auto industry will be found wanting in terms of being technically ready to introduce ethanol with 20% blending. The problem I would like to address more from the consumer standpoint of view. What happens to the existing vehicles, most of which are compliant to 10% blending of ethanol and definitely not 20% blending of ethanol? So will there be a simultaneous supply for 10% blended ethanol fuel and 20% blended ethanol fuel? Because vehicles which are not compliant with 20% blending will have a problem, because ethanol is a corrosive solvent, and it will require changes of all fuel lines, all rubber components. Will it be technically possible? Not possible. What does the Indian consumer do who has an existing only ethanol 10 blended compliant vehicle and not an ethanol 20 blended compliant vehicle? The second problem, again, from the consumer point of view, is that any water ingress in the fuel tank, and which normally does happen, specifically during monsoons, during servicing, there is some water ingress which happens. It stops the blending, and the ethanol and the gasoline gets separated. The ethanol settles down, and the fuel system will suck ethanol before it sucks gasoline, which will create problems like starting, which will misfire the engine, which could even result in stalling of the vehicles. And finally, of course, there are experts who believe that an 20% ethanol blended fuel might also impact the engine components and bring down the fuel efficiency by 2 to 4%. So these are issues which will need to be addressed. And in any case, the auto industry has been fighting with the regulations coming in almost every year, bringing up the cost to the consumer, bringing up investments in new technology. So I think those are the challenges that the government will need to look at.
Yeah, Mr. Sanghi, just to follow up then, you have a good point, because there is, first there was BS6 norms, then there are CAFE norms which are now under discussion, and then the auto industry would have to deal with 20% ethanol blending. What do you think can be done to incentivize both the consumer and automakers?
So, Tamanna, I don't think it has to do with incentivizing either of them. It's more to do with how do we handle the problem which will be created by it for car owners or two-wheeler owners who have just bought their cars, because those cars are good enough for at least next 15 years. That's the end of life that we presume is of vehicles. And if these are not ethanol 20% blended compliant, then what do they do with these cars? What do they do with these automobiles? And these are not cheap. So I think it's more to do with how do we handle the problem so the pain to the consumer is minimized, the pain to the industry is minimized, and can we keep the prices in check? Prices which are already skyrocketing for so many reasons, can we keep the prices in check? These are issues that we will need to definitely address. It's not so much about incentivizing the industry or the consumer.
Mr. Majumdar, in your view, do you think that the industry right now is ready to come to the 20% ethanol target? And what are the downside risks of sugar prices being affected over the long term if dependence on ethanol as a byproduct, which would be more lucrative perhaps for sugar companies and for farmers over time? What is the downside risk to actual sugar commodity prices getting too high?
The point is, we are already exporting about 5 million tons of sugar. Now the point is, if that entire diversion of exports was to take, the route of ethanol, production of ethanol, we would safely be able to reach that 20%. So I really don't think from a supply of sugar. I mean, of course, the mills and the farmers would all want high sugar prices, but I don't think, higher production of ethanol by sacrificing on the exports will really destabilize the domestic sugar prices from the consumer's perspective. Yes, there is a possibility that, let's suppose, some of these new varieties in UP lose steam, or there are major weather issues which substantially result in a reduction of sugarcane production. But in that case, of course, the government always has the option of reducing the ethanol offtake. So, balancing is possible. So I don't think from the consumer perspective, at this moment, we need to be considered too much about, price shock because of diversion towards ethanol, at least up to the 20% level.
Is there a concern over things like, Mr. Majumdar, follow-up question for you, that ethanol, sometimes an ethanol blended fuel is sometimes less efficient as a fuel, it has lower energy content, it could result in more fuel consumption, lower mileage. Are all of these downsides, or do you think they're overcome from the benefits of solving the big crisis of what do we do with all of our excess sugar?
Yeah, so let's be clear that, ethanol and petrol, they are not really equivalent. I mean, we talk about, ethanol being priced at, let's say, 50 rupee or 60 rupee, while, petrol is 100 rupees. But it's not really an apple-to-apple comparison. I mean, if you look, and because almost, as we know, that almost half the price which is there in petrol is really taxes. So, at $70, the real cost of petrol will be perhaps somewhere in the 40 rupees. And then, of course, we have to remember that, ethanol's, specific, fuel values somewhere around 40% or so of petrol. I think petrol is about 11,000 kcal per liter, whereas ethanol is about 4,600. So, in terms of price, in terms of, calorific value, of course, ethanol is low, much lower than petrol. But again, ethanol also has its advantage in the sense that it's a cleaner burning fuel, it's an oxidant in the fuel. So there are, pluses and minuses of using, ethanol doped petrol.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to see how it goes. Praful, just a very short answer from you, please. Do you think that sugar industry is geared up to it, and will it help solve the long-standing problems of price differentials between sugar farmers, sugarcane producers, and of course the sugar processing companies?
This is all possible because nowadays MSP to sell sugar came under Essential Commodities Act 1955. So to sell below that price is not allowed, and there is no question of customer to get problem or sugar price to go up, because from last 3 years we are almost having 9 to 11 million ton of opening stock, which against we require only 6 million ton of, even after export of 6 million ton of sugar and diversion to ethanol, we have closing stock of average 10 million metric ton. So sugar availability is not a problem because as Mr. Majumdar says that after 2023, according to WTO, we cannot export sugar with subsidy, and we will have enough sugar anytime. So customers' problem is not there, and yes, the industry is already. We have already built up another capacity of say 50 crore liters already now. Now it is now around say 500 crore liters, and to reach another say 100% is of course challengeable. But the way the bottom line of the sugar industry, you will see the results currently of Q4. They are all getting so nicely. Persons who has already gone for the distilleries. So it is a attract to the sugar industry, and yes, it is achievable of 20%. But I also acknowledge Mr. Sanghi's concern and Majumdar's views. So we have to see any new era when we have a challenge, but challenge do overcomes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us and, giving us details of what this ethanol policy will look like, how it will help, what are the pros and what are the cons. We'll keep a close eye on how it moves forward and how it actually helps the sugarcane farmers at the end of the day. Well, we have our